the question as to what is grace.
Excuse me, how does it fit in as we all struggle with whatever our struggles, and how does it manifest, or how does it appear?
As either the desire for truth or the longing for God. When the truth or reality of our experience seems to be missing, or when God, that is infinite being, seems to be absent, we believe and feel that we are a separate fragment of experience. And that fragment feels two essential movements in life. One, the desire to complete itself through the acquisition of an object, substance, state, or relationship. And two, the activity to protect itself from objects and others which seem to threaten its existence. So the ignoring or the veiling of reality, the overlooking of our true nature, by definition precipitates these two movements. Desire for objects, fear of objects. That is the sense of lack which expresses itself in longing or desire, and the fear of being harmed or destroyed by outside objects or others. So the sense of lack and the fear of death are the two essential ingredients of the separate self. So all separate selves feel within them this discomfort, either the sense of lack or the fear of disappearance. And it is this discomfort, this essential discomfort, that expresses itself as desire. In most people, that desire is for objects, states of mind, activities, substances and relationships. But in time, this desire becomes refined. When all these objects, substances, states of mind, etc. have failed us sufficiently often, our desire becomes refined, and it turns into longing for God, the ultimate object, the one thing, the one possible source of happiness, having exhausted all the other sources. And this longing for God, in a way, it's the last desire. It's the highest desire that can be conceived. It's still going outwards. Any longing is going outwards. But it is in a way the noblest desire. The desire for truth or the desire for God. That desire, in fact, is the true self, what is truly meant by God, infinite being, pulling the separate self back to itself. We think that the separate self thinks that it is doing the desiring. Mm-hmm. No. Mm-hmm. The separate self does nothing. The separate self is not even there to do something. But what the separate self feels as its own desire is, in fact, God calling it back into its heart. Mm. That's the movement of grace. Mm. Is the true self, infinite being, indivisible consciousness, pulling the illusory self back into its heart. From the illusory perspective of the separate self, that is felt as desire for an object or longing for God. That is grace. In other words, in every movement of attention is a more or less thinly veiled act of grace.
It seems as if it almost seems as if grace is preceded by some dark night of the soul or some struggle that then coalesces and expresses itself in this way. Is that an accurate understanding?
It can be, not necessary.
Mm.
It's true, a lot of people, or let's say some people, like the prodigal son, have to go to the end of the possibilities in the objective realm. They have to try everything in their search for happiness, be disappointed by everything and everyone, and get to the end of objects. So suicide comes from that place. The desire for suicide comes from that place. I've got to the end of my prodigal journey. Remember the prodigal son? He was eating the pig's food. He had explored everything. There was nowhere else for him to go. There are two options then. Either to, in this despair that you talk about, this dark night of the soul, the impulse to just put an end to my existence. That for some people seems to be the only possibility. But it's not the only possibility. The other possibility is to, instead of having been failed by all objects, instead of facing further in the direction of objects out into the abyss of despair in that direction, it is to turn round. And that's the meaning of the parable of the prodigal son. He was in despair, facing the abyss, and he turned round. That's all he did. Remember in the story, he didn't go running towards the Father. The Father came running towards him. So as a concession, having said the separate self does nothing, as a concession to the existence of the separate self, we can say the separate self turns round. In fact, it is turned round by grace. It doesn't even turn round. It is turned round. The attention is turned round by the magnetic force, the gravitational pull of its true nature, drawing it back. Having been stretched, remember attention, a stretching of attention. It's been stretched right to the end of objects. And it is the pull back from its source, the source of attention, that turns the attention round and attracts it. The separate self does nothing. It is attracted back to its source in the heart, God's being. That pull is grace.
Is this why it feels as if it occurs as opposed to any kind of, you can't will grace as a separate self or as anything. Yes. And so would you say that grace then occurs sort of as it happens to the separate self? It just...
Grace is in fact always occurring. Whenever there is a separate self, grace is acting on the separate self. But grace is felt. There's no such thing as a separate self without desire and fear. Mm-hmm. The separate self, in fact, is not an entity that desires and fears. The separate self is the movement of desire and fear, seeking and resistance. Mm-hmm. The separate self is not an entity. It is an activity of seeking and resistance. And the reason it is seeking and resisting is because at the core of the sense of self, of the separate self, is the sense of lack and the fear of disappearance. It is in response to the sense of lack that it is always desiring objects. It is in response to the fear of disappearing that it always resisting experience. So this movement towards objects is inherent in the separate self. And whenever that separate self is present, whenever this movement towards objects is present, whenever there is the stretching of ourself towards the object, there is always an equal and opposite force pulling it back in the other direction. So whenever there is a separate self, grace is acting. It is not just something that happens momentarily in our lives. We may notice it momentarily and say, oh, that meeting was a graceful event. Actually, grace is acting on the separate self all the time, pulling it back, inviting it back, encouraging it back to its source.
That's very encouraging. I like that. It's it's never occurred to me quite that way. It's almost you can't fight it because it's happening anyway.
Yes, yes. It's not possible to be a separate self without desiring. Desire and fear, the two sides of the same coin, seeking and resisting, it's the same thing. So whenever there is a separate self, there is a desire. Why? Because its true nature of happiness has been veiled. The separate self is the veiling of happiness. So whenever the apparently separate self is present, it is by definition searching happiness. The separate self is the search for happiness. So what is experienced as the separate self, as a search for happiness, is in fact an invitation from happiness.
Thank you. Aha. Great.
So even, we could say, our desire for God is God's desire for us. We don't even desire God. The separate self does nothing. It is nothing. But from the illusory point of view of the separate self, God's love for us is felt like our love for him.
Thank you. That's very beautiful. Very beautiful. Thank you.